Partner, are you ready?
Yes.
Opponents ready?
Yes.
Judge? All right, then I'll begin. Article 98, the resolution, resolved, the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. We provide the following definition of the word ought as a duty or correctness from Oxford Dictionary. We also provide the following observations. First, this debate should be weighed on a cost-benefit analysis. If we show that there are more harms than benefits, then cons should win. Our second observation is that the pro must prove that economically, socially, and politically, reparations will solve. Lastly, in this round, we aren't only looking to the intent of reparations, but rather the real-life impacts within the United States as a whole. Contention 1, paying reparations will have harmful effects. Subpoint A, financially draining. Chen in 2007 concluded, one analysis published in 2004 by sociologist Joe R. Fain estimated that the compensation for coerced labor and related economic damages would amount to trillions of dollars. Subpoint B, mixed-race people further complicate the issue of reparations. Hawkins in 2014 states, there are no living slaves, so it's impossible to compensate the people who were hurt by the cruel and oppressive practice of slavery. So would we compensate black Americans in general on the theory that slavery has held them back? Blaming economic problems someone has today on something that happened to his ancestors almost a century and a half ago seems like a stretch. What do we do about people like Barack Obama or Tiger Woods who are of mixed heritage? Would Obama pay reparations to himself? Would a black man who immigrated to the United States a decade ago be eligible? What about incredibly wealthy black Americans? Contention 2, relations between American citizens will worsen if reparations are paid. Subpoint A, race relations. Flaherty and Carlisle in 2004 state, a particularly disturbing ramification of compensating descendants of African slaves is the dangerous precedent it would set. It would open up a Pandora's box of other groups seeking reparations for the injustices suffered by their ancestors. Blacks in America, of course, suffered incredible hardships in the past, but so did other races. The truth is that prior to the 20th century, life was exceedingly harsh for the large majority of people, not only to blacks but of many races, nationalities, and religious creeds. Enlightened ideas of tolerance, fairness, and human rights, which most of us enjoy today, had not yet become widespread throughout the civilized world. Actions that are illegal today, such as slavery, indentured servitude, institutionalized discrimination, and inhumane working conditions, were legal back then. Subpoint B, federal reparations put a reparation cost on all taxpayers. The New York Times in 2014 state, the question is who would pay for them, and the sad truth is that the harms of slavery and Jim Crow are greater than the wealth they created. Moreover, the primary beneficiaries of those systems are now gone. Payments will have come from taxpayers who have no culpability for those past crimes and have little, if any, benefit. Subpoint C, we've already paid reparations. Hawkins in 2014 reports, although whites make up the majority of Americans on welfare, percentage-wise, roughly twice as many black Americans take government assistance as white Americans. Additionally, there are affirmative action programs and racial set-asides that discriminate against white and Asian Americans to make it easier for black Americans to get jobs and to get into college. Contention 3, economic advancements of African Americans. According to Sherman in 2013, as African Americans moved from agriculture to other industries, they also broadened their participation in higher paid occupations. During the 20th century, African Americans moved into higher paying occupations at a much faster rate than their white counterparts. The percentage ratio of African American to white men in the highest paying occupation, managerial, and professional jobs increased, while the percentage ratio of African American men to white men in the lowest paying occupation, farming, forestry, and fishing, decreased. African American women have moved into white-collar jobs at a much faster rate than African American men, and faster than either white men or white women. The impact of our entire case is that there is no efficient system that can be implemented to successfully pay reparations. This is logistically challenging, assuming the fact that African Americans can prove that they have ties with slavery in the United States. And since there are no living slaves, it is hard to calculate how many people are actually affected by slavery. Mixed race and wealthy African Americans only further complicate the issue of reparations. Also, paying reparations is going to exacerbate our national debt, and it will not bring any benefit to African Americans in the end if our national debt is hurt. When economic output rises or falls, the federal budget is automatically affected. Economic downturns can reduce revenue significantly and raise unemployment rates. Furthermore, African Americans are making economic advancements, and thus we urge a calm ballot. Okay, sorry.
Opponents, are you ready?
Yeah.
Partner?
Yes.
And I shall begin kind of while you're...
Yeah, of course.
Is the judge ready? Alright. My partner and I affirm today's resolutions. Contention 1, generational problems. Williams, 2011. The injustices done to the social group African Americans was not simply an oppression inflicted on all the individual African Americans living during the slavery and Jim Crow eras. The injustices were imposed on African Americans as a group. Segregation and discrimination were targeted at the group even as it affected individuals. The result, and in most cases the objective, was to keep African Americans as a social group in a lower position in a social hierarchy. In the process, society's institutions oppressed African Americans as a social group. The systematic oppression of this group diminished the life chances of individual African Americans. In turn, the harmful conditions of the social group affected nearly all the individuals within the group. Contention 2, social welfare failed. Discovered in Networks 2004. The welfare state expanded dramatically after Lyndon Johnson. Between the mid-60s and mid-70s, the dollar value of public housing quadrupled and the amount of spending on food stamps rose more than tenfold. Between 1965 and 1996, the government provided benefits increased by a factor of 8. By 1974, such benefits were an astounding 20 times higher than they had been in 1965. Also, as of 1974, federal spending on social welfare programs amounted to 16% of America's gross national product, a far cry from the 8% figures of 1960. By 1977, the number of people receiving public assistance had more than doubled since 1960. The more devastating byproduct of this mushroom welfare state was the corrosive effect it had on the black community. Williams, 2011. The civil rights movement culminated in laws such as the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and Open Housing Act being passed that ended legalized segregation and discrimination, effectively making discrimination illegal. However, the changes brought about by these movements did little to abate the systematic separation of the races that resulted from racialization. Both the racialization and its effects continued. While African Americans got the security of legal protection, they were not fully afforded moral regard, and they did not enjoy full rights of full political participation. They were granted full citizenship protection, but they did not have the security of full actual citizenship. The society remained segregated even though it was not legally enforced. Whites tend to move away from black population areas, and through a system of extra legal methods, they prevented many blacks from moving into white neighborhoods. People's economic and cultural opportunities depend on where they live and the associations that they obtain. Because of the fact that the de facto segregation and the persistent negative racial attitudes, blacks continue to have a reduced opportunity in the public sphere. These facts demonstrate that the civil rights movement failed as a remedy to problems of racialization. And contention 3, inequality, subpoint A. Well, The Atlantic, 2015. When it comes to financial stability, black Americans are often in a much more precarious situation financially than white Americans. Their unemployment rate is much higher, and so the level of poverty within the black community. In 2013, the poverty rate amongst white Americans was 9.6%. Amongst black Americans, it was 27.2%. And the gap between the wealth of white families and black families have widened to their highest levels, according to the 2014 study on the Pew Research poll. Perhaps what's most unsettling about the current economic situation in black America is that black families that attain the middle class status, the likelihood that their children will remain there or do any better isn't high. The greater possibility of slipping back applies to blacks across all income groups. According to the Fed study, about 60% of black children whose parents had incomes that fell into the 50th percent distribution saw that their own income fell into the bottom half during the childhood. The types of downward slide was common for only 36% of white children. Subpoint B, education. U.S. News and World Report, more than 2 million black students attended schools where 90% of the school body is made up of minority students. Dozens of school districts have current desegregation orders. Minority students represent 57% of the dropout factors. On average, serving minority populations have less experienced, lower paid teachers who are less likely to be certified. A report from the Center for American Progress found that 10 percentage point increase in the students of colors at a school is associated with a decrease in per pupil spending of $75. For these reasons, we urge a pro ballot. Yeah. I don't know.
So you can just.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I have first question. So a lot of your cases are dependent on the fact that these minorities are specifically African Americans, right? So like you're saying,
Yes.
like with your contention 3 is that like the education, like you just talked about minorities in general, so like are
Not
these-
minorities,
are
no,
these-
African Americans.
No, but you just said minorities in some of your case. So is that specific to African Americans? Like,
Yes,
are they
it is.
actually being impacted, or is it just minorities in general? So
No,
would
it
be,
is
like,
African Americans.
Like,
It's African Americans that are specifically being impacted because they are going to schools that have predominantly low qualified, like low performing students, and so the teachers reflect that, and so they
right,
are not
your
able
case
to
just
break
said that
away
it was
from
minorities
poverty.
In general, not necessarily specifically.
You can look at our case
African
later on, but we specifically talk
Okay.
about African Americans.
Okay,
Now, in your
question.
contention 2, subpoint B, what do you mean by the reparations have already been paid when like these citizens are like treated as second-hand citizens?
Okay, so what we're telling you is that welfare already exists, and like it already exists within the status quo, and it is.
So how has
Black
welfare
Americans.
impacted like how has welfare like positively impacted the black
I mean, with
community?
affirmative action and with,
With
you know,
affirmative-
them being able to get into better colleges and better and
How-
have better
how-
jobs, like because of affirmative action, different other welfare programs within the status quo. Can I ask you another question?
Yes.
Okay, so again, in your contention, you talked about how like the food stamps and housing and different like public associations.
Yes.
But is this specific to African Americans? Because in the second
This
part
is-
of your contention,
This
you
is
talk about
yes.
how, like,
let me talk about this.
Okay.
Like it's specific to African Americans because African Americans made up were the reason that these programs were out, put into place. The major beneficiaries of this system was African Americans, but like on the other side, they became too dependent on government handouts, and
okay,
so
but
they
is it them
devastated.
specifically?
Huh?
Like, are they making up the majority of the population like that is using these different programs such as like
Yes.
housing and food stamps? Okay, do you have evidence of that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have a question?
Yeah. All right. What was your subpoint A of your contention 2?
The race relations, I believe it was. Yeah, it was race relations. Okay, can I ask another
Yeah.
question? How would reparations solve for like the moral regard that you discussed toward the end of your contention 2 when you talked about how the
All
civil
right.
rights movement was ineffective? How would reparations exactly solve for that?
What we're talking about, that's a complete clash with your contention when you're talking about that reparations have already been paid. The government programs that were put into place in order to answer for the welfare problem, this only furthered the decline of Black America. And so what we're saying is that it has failed. And so what we're saying, what our burden today is to prove that reparations should be paid. It's not how the reparations will be implemented.
Right, but you're just giving all these issues and you're not actually looking to like
Yes,
real
because
life impacts with like,
it's
within the African American
a real life
community and
impact
within
because
America as a whole.
no. But how can you expect a community of people to be to rise into the middle class and to be equal when they're being subjugated to second class
But
citizenship?
you're not even telling us how this would be feasible
Yes,
in
and
the real world.
well, it's against the rules of public forum in order to like provide for solvency.
Okay, it's not even that, but we're just telling you, is this going to be feasible or not? Or
It is absolutely our burden is to prove well, should they, and they absolutely
is
should
it
after being
feasible and, like-
subjugated to second-hand citizenship.
But also goes along with, is this feasible or not?
It is absolutely feasible. Should we always
How
negate?
so?
Should we always
it's gonna
negate
put our-
doing
if
what
it's
is
gonna put our
right
country
for
into an
doing what is
economic downturn, then it
easy?
shouldn't be- then it's not
Absolutely
feasible.
not. Is there a
Obviously,
question?
it's
Is there a
gonna
question?
negatively, impact all of
Is there a
America.
question?
That's time.
All right.
I'm going to be taking.
No, exactly. He just gives like an exception to. He just gives like a ton of these things for like crimes happening to minorities in general, and especially when he talks about his contention, he said like 27% African Americans like are in poverty rate, but like he doesn't give kind of scope as to like what other minorities are on that scale. Do you know what I mean?
That's really accurate.
Okay.
Okay. Can you move around? Talk about it?
Yeah. Wait, hold up. I need my pen. Yeah,
Okay. Opponents ready?
Yes.
Judge ready? And Madison, are you ready?
Yes.
Alright, let's begin. Okay, so starting off with our framework, we have a couple things to define. So we defined ought as a duty or correctness, and we also pulled through the framework of economically, politically, and socially. The pro must prove how reparations are going to be solving for this issue today. And also we're going to be looking at this on a cost-benefit analysis. We're showing you that there are more harms than benefits in this round, and we'll prove that after my summary, after my rebuttal. And again, remember we have to see that the factor in this is the U.S. federal government. It is the job of the U.S. federal government. It is the duty or correctness or the the U.S. federal government ought to look out in the best interest of the United States as a whole, not just these African Americans. Remember that this is not feasible, and this is going to be putting our country in an economic downturn, but let's get back to that. So starting off with the contention one, we talk about generational cycle of poverty, talk about these discrimination, but remember that redlining and all these things, the housing policy has been reformed. They're acting like it's still going on today. All these things have actually been reformed, and these things have been illegal and banned. Moving on to the contention two, where they talk about social welfare. Remember that they were talking about social welfare, that can be reformed, so we should just reform the social welfare. How are reparations going to be solving for this? That is the biggest question in today's debate, and they have not yet answered that. Moving down to where they talked about reduced opportunity for these African Americans, but they never explained how reparations, again, how will they fix it? And also, they're looking at this in a perfect world scenario that if you give these reparations, it's going to fix everything. Remember, Judge, that is not the issue that we're looking at today. We have to look at the logistics and the feasibility behind everything that they're doing in this debate. So in a perfect world, this would work, but in the actual world, this would not work. And remember that these would actually dehumanize these people if you give them this money. Chen in 2007 says that companies and government institutions might resort to justice on the cheap, aiming simply to pay blacks X amount of dollars, and then we're all done with the whole issue of racism in our society. So what we're trying to say here is that giving this money will be dehumanizing and putting a dollar value on their lives. How can we put a dollar value on someone's suffering? And again, these people that are benefiting, or these African Americans that are getting it, wouldn't even feel comfortable getting money because it's justice on the cheap. Moving down to the contention three, to talk about inequality. They bring up the point as financially they're in struggle and they're struggling, but we also have to remember that white people that are paying for this thing, not just white people, but like everybody else in the United States, everyone that is paying for this, all the taxpayer money that is going to here, these people are innocent. Most of, like we said, the beneficiaries of all the slavery people, they're all dead. So why should innocent people pay for something that happened years ago? Why should people that had nothing to do with anything pay for anything that happened now? And again, remember that this will be increasing racial relations, as we stated. Because what we're saying is that it's going to be opening a Pandora's box effect, which is saying that everyone will want the reparations. The Indians will want the reparations. The Mexicans will want the reparations. We can't have everybody wanting their own reparations. Carlisle and Flaherty in 2004 says that reparations would exacerbate racial divisions. The notion of forcing innocents to pay people who were never enslaved would likely generate bitterness throughout the whole country. In addition, the transfer of wealth from the non-poor blacks to the more affluent blacks would stir widespread outrage. To force whites today, who were not in any way responsible for slavery, to payments for black people, many of whom would be better off, would create nothing but great resentment among the whites. Ultimately, the ultimate result, he warns, will be racial warfare. In addition to exacerbating racial relations, slave reparations would weaken any national effort to eradicate poverty among blacks. Also, remember that these mixed race people, this is going to be extremely logistically challenging. And also their contention theory, they talk about education. We have a couple responses to this. The first is that it's non-unique. Also, putting in more money into education does not mean better education for everybody. CBS News in June 2013 states that the United States spent $15,171 on each young person in the system, more than any other nation combined in the report. And still, this is not enough, what we're saying. And also, this is not a direct benefit to African Americans, and they give no link to how this would actually work in the real world. And also, remember that proving solvency is not against the rules of the public forum. And for all these reasons, I strongly urge a con ballot in today's round.
Can we take like 1 minute prep?
Wait. For the sake of running prep, starting now.
Because I didn't get to finish the education component. Like, make sure that you say like when there's an increase in 10% there's 75% like $75 less. And then there's a part that said that like the corporations that benefited from slavery and that dictatorship.
I don't know.
In addition, when they confronted they said like this week to expect
Yeah, I wonder if second increase relations are proposing, but also I wonder if this. Okay.
Okay, that was 1 minute and 3 seconds.
you have the cards in there.
mind if I like time, please?
Yeah.
No.
Alright. Get it situated here. Alright, so I'm just going to go straight down the con flow, and if time allows, I'm going to move on to answer my opponent's main argument against our case. Opponents, are you ready?
Yes.
Noel, are you ready?
Yes.
Judge? Alright, then we shall begin. First, I'd like to start off that we accept their definition of ought, that it is the duty of, that ought should be defined as duty. Moving on to their first observation, that we should analyze this on a cost-benefit analysis system. Alright, so when we talk about costs and benefits, we also have to look at the cost and the price that African Americans are paying right now, every day when they live. Price in 2014. Continuing residential and educational segregation along with discriminatory economic policy means that we can still identify neighborhoods, schools, and other community institutions that, with the provision of resources, can improve many African American lives. According to the Federal Center for Disease Control and Prevention, African Americans have the highest death rates from heart disease and the highest HIV infection rates. The average black high school graduate is 4 years behind their white counterparts. Equalizing funding in these schools would be an immediate boon to the lives of black children and families, and ultimately the nation. So when we're looking at the cost-benefit analysis, yes, take into the cost that African Americans are paying every single day for every day that we refuse to pay them reparations in order to improve their lives. Moving on to the second observation, when they say that the pro must justify how reparations would improve the lives of African Americans economically, socially, and politically. The con must also meet the same observation, that they have to prove that reparations would not benefit African Americans economically, socially, and politically in order to make this debate fair. If both sides end up not being able to meet this observation, then we should drop this observation from the entire debate. Moving on to the third observation, that we should that we should prove that reparations would improve the United States as a whole. Alright, we don't even need this to be an observation, because if we improve the lives of this large minority in the United States because of all the discriminatory acts placed upon them by the United States government for all these years, then we will, yes, be improving the United States as a whole. Moving on to their contention one, where they talk about the harms of paying reparations. If you look at Williams from 2011, he states that there's nothing that would suggest that there needs to be a rapid wholesale change comparable to revolution. Changes can be slow and build on each other. There's nothing that says that we need to implement one big policy called a reparations bill and call it finished. Policies can be implemented on a gradual basis. The only criterion is that the policies have to work towards a participatory democratic social relationship. Difficult does not mean impossible. So when our opponents keep saying that this is very difficult to calculate, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. Because look back at the definition of ought. It is our duty and our obligation to give them reparations. Just because it's hard to find feasibility does not mean that we should not pay reparations. The problems with feasibility of reparation policies can come from racial animosity within the political culture. So this is actually just a political problem, not feasibility. Now moving on to later on the contention one, when they talk about draining money. This entire debate is, when they talk about the cost of reparations. This entire debate is about reparations, which is money. So cost is definitely going to be this debate. So you can just cross out the contention one, subpoint A, because it has nothing to do with this debate. And there's subpoint B about mixed race individuals. This is non-resolutional. Whoever identifies themselves as African American, and also the resolution does not call for these African Americans to be able to delineate their ancestry to slavery. So whenever they talk about slavery, later on in contention 2, that these individuals, it's hard to trace them back to slavery, the resolution does not call that African Americans have to be able to trace their ancestry back to slavery. Now, that you can exactly cross out the contention 1 and contention 2 subpoint C. Also, moving on to the contention 2, when they talk about race relations, we cannot compare, and other minorities who want reparations as well, we cannot compare the harms done to African Americans to other minorities in the United States, because we have economically, socially, and politically been beaten by the U.S. government, beaten down African Americans throughout history, since slavery until today. Also, in their contention, when they talk about taxpayers' money, actually this money doesn't even have to come from the taxpayers' money to the government, because the institutions that actually participate in discriminatory acts towards African Americans can actually pay for the reparations. And for these reasons, we strongly urge pro.
Are you ready for cross?
Yes.
everybody ready?
Yes.
Okay, so how can we determine if we have to do, how can we determine to do something if we don't look at the logistics?
Well, what's a logistical problem with this?
Okay, what we're trying to say is logistically challenging because how can we trace back these people? Like, how can we actually put this into play?
Okay, when you say trace back, you mean trace them back to having
To any
ancestors
stuff.
who were slaves.
Right, any
That's
stuff.
what you mean. All right, so can you tell me where in the resolution it says that the U.S. should pay reparations to African Americans who are descendants of slaves?
It says African Americans, so I'm bringing up the example because slavery happened to African Americans.
Right, but that's not the only.
Right, but you're saying
yeah, but
it's
that's not the only
non-resolution,
action
but it
taken.
is.
Not entirely, because if your whole argument rests that this is logistically impossible because we can't trace African Americans today back to their ancestors who may have been
No,
slaves,
also,
then you have no
because
argument.
How do you know? No, that's not, okay, that's one of the things. I can do another one, which is your subpoint B. When you talk about education, how do you know for sure that this money is going to be benefiting these African Americans? How could you implement that? That's what we're trying to say is logistically
Okay,
challenging.
we're not proposing a plan of saying whether or not with these individuals they choose to improve their lives by. I mean, these individuals, if we
But
give
just
the individuals
because you put money
reparations,
into
these
education
individuals know
doesn't
where their
mean-
money has to go,
Right,
and
but
they'll spend it accordingly.
Okay, but just because you put money into education doesn't mean the employment
Okay,
rates
is there a question here?
increase. No, okay. Can you
All right,
do you have a
I have a
question?
question.
Yeah.
All right, so could you tell me how affirmative action have actually benefited African Americans?
Sure. So when you're talking about affirmative action, it's when they discriminate against whites and Asians and everybody else except for African Americans, so it's easier for them to get into college. So that's what we're trying to say is already in action, so we don't have to
Okay,
do all
but
this.
do you
We're
have
talking about
any evidence
education
showing
and
that affirmative action actually works?
it's implemented right now in our government.
That doesn't mean it doesn't work. Just because it's existing, does that mean that affirmative action actually works?
I don't know how
To
you-
me, okay, so what is
How do
the
you want
goal
me
of
to
affirmative action?
The goal of affirmative action is to get African Americans into colleges easier because they're discriminating against everybody else so that they have their numbers.
Okay, so you're saying that the way to stop discrimination is to engage in more discrimination,
No,
and that's going to solve this.
no, that's already discrimination that's already there. So you're saying we have to take it out and put in reparations. What I'm trying to argue is what we already have in place is fine, and you adding in reparations is going to make everything worse.
How?
Because what we're saying in our contention too, we're saying that race relations will actually increase. They'll be worsened because all these like white resentments of people that are innocent that are paying.
Okay, so you're saying that the only people who are paying these reparations are white?
No, everybody else is going to be, the resentment will increase. And like one of our evidence that we read, the racial warfare.
Okay, so when a government collects taxes from the people, is that money still the people's money, or is it the government's money to spend to improve our country?
Right, but this isn't improving everybody. This is improving one section of our country. The
Okay,
US
but would you
government
agree that
should
this
look-
is that the African American community is a minority that has historically been beaten down by the United States government, socially, politically, economically?
Okay, so, do you want me to answer this one?
If you want to, you can.
Okay, we'll touch on this one.
All right.
Okay, read. There's 40 seconds.
We're going to take body part really quick.
Okay.
I am starting now.
Okay.
Okay, you're ready. All right. Opponents, are you ready?
Yes.
Judge, are you ready? I think.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just going to start by going over our definition and conservations, and then I am going to go through key voters and I'll signpost as I go in case I go through rebuttals or cases. Okay, everyone's ready, right? Okay, then I will begin. Okay, so start off with our definition of ought, which we carried through the entire round, which they completely accepted. That the U.S. federal government should be doing something that like ought they do this, it should be feasible and yeah, basically we carry our definition of ought throughout the entire round. And in a perfect world, sure, this would be great and all, but like feasibility is a thing, and yeah. And we're going to extend our first observation, the cost-benefit analysis, which the only thing that they had to attack this with was the price African Americans pay, and with the education gap, and that's not unique to this argument because like how would reparations exactly fix this? Like they don't give any solvency to throughout their entire case. And our second observation, which we tell you that this needs to economically, politically, and socially, that these all need to benefit, and they say that we carry this burden as well, and we are meeting that. Economically, we're meeting it with the debt. So if we do pay these reparations, our government will be completely in debt, and like that's obviously not going to benefit any race whatsoever. Not just African Americans, but everyone's going to suffer, not just one specific group. And politically, the U.S. federal government ought they do this? No, they ought not do this, because it would ultimately put the country in detriment. And third, socially, we talk about like race relations throughout our entire piece, which I'll get to with our key voters. So our first key voter is going to be the harmful impact. So we tell you that the money that the U.S. government would be spending as a whole, it's only going to impact African Americans. And even if it does benefit them to some degree, it's only benefiting them, and then that's taking that money away from the rest of the country. So ultimately, the country as a whole is not going to be positively impacted, which we need to look to the U.S. federal government, which the resolution states. And next we talk about under harmful effects, the mixed race. This is a complete how exactly are we going to determine who's going to get these reparations, and is this actually feasible? And we can't look to the benefits, which they don't necessarily give. They just tell you what's wrong with society currently, and they don't give you, hey, this is how this will be fixed. They just tell you, hey, this is all wrong, and reparations would fix that, but that's totally hypothetical. And second, we talk about race relations, and this would open a Pandora's box that basically that other races would be asking for reparations as well, which we can't necessarily give, and it's going to cause bad discourse, and the other minorities suffering. So basically, African Americans might benefit, but other groups wouldn't necessarily, and we're putting a dollar value on their lives, which isn't necessarily going to benefit society as a whole. And they completely dropped our third contention. So for these reasons, we urge a con ballot.
We'll take some 30 seconds because I have to.
Running down.
All right, it's that's a lot of the observational stuff that we need to do because I'm confused. You get what I'm saying? What should I say about that?
Okay, that was done.
All right. So off-time roadmap. I'll start off with the voting issues. Yep, and then begin debating. So opponents, are you ready?
Yes.
Partner,
Yes.
judge.
Yeah.
Oh, may I borrow your time, please?
No.
Yeah.
All right. So let's begin. Okay, first I want to acknowledge their observations. They have not met their own observation. Okay, moving on to our contentions, our voting issues. First is the generational problems. They say that redlining is non-existent, but how is this possible when 59 schools are under desegregation orders? If redlining is non-existent, that means that black people will not be put in one section of the city. And if black people weren't put into one section of the city, they wouldn't be going to one school. So redlining is still effective today because we have so many schools under under desegregation orders. Additionally, part of the difference in educational outcomes stems from the difference in environment black and white children live in during the school year. Black children are more likely to live in households where they are low income, extremely poor, food insecure, receiving long-term welfare support. And this stems additionally from our second contention when we say that social welfare failed. What we're saying is that because African Americans were treated as second-hand citizens, they were not allowed to leave the section of the city that they were originally inhabited. White people made sure that they couldn't move out of it, and that's what creates social tension between whites and black, a lack of understanding. Additionally, moving on to the second voting issue, which is the social welfare failed. Additionally, the only response that the con team gave was reform. Well, reform did not stop the treating of African Americans as second-hand citizens. Additionally, it did not stop the redlining, and additionally, it did not stop African Americans from being at the bottom. All right, after slavery, they were not given equal status amongst white individuals. They were put under Jim Crow, which subjugated them into second-hand citizenship. Additionally, in our third voting issue is inequality. Inequality exists amongst whites and blacks in wealth. We've mentioned that 9.2% of unemployment amongst whites versus 27.2%. How is this even possible? It's because they have been subjugated to second-class citizenship. And additionally, I want to attack their third contention when they talk about economy. Obviously, there's going to be an increase in blacks participating in the marketplace because they look at the century after slavery. So it only makes sense that there's going to be an increase because blacks finally have the opportunity to go into those jobs. And additionally, and for those reasons, I vote pro ballot.
You guys ready for granted?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Do you want first question? Okay. All right. So everyone's ready.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
Okay.
Let's go.
So, simple question. In our observation, we tell you that you have to meet like these 3 standards. So,
Yeah.
can you
Yes.
explain to us exactly how you meet those standards?
Alright, so first economically, they will benefit economically because they will not be subjugated to secondhand
But-
citizenship. Let me finish, because in our first intention we told you that they were barred from economic institutions.
Right.
Secondly, they were barred from, I mean, you can read our first contention.
Okay, but what about
entirely
America?
What about
how they were
politically and
barred.
socially? Can you answer
Okay,
this?
politically and socially, well, I can tell you, it goes in our first contention in the
Right.
part that we read.
Okay.
They said, like, by institution, I mean economic institutions, such as the market employment network, political infrastructure, politically as in the infrastructure of the party system, political
about
associations,
social?
and state and I'm getting there.
Okay.
And then state bureaucracies, and then social, such as associations, churches, schools, and universities.
How were those approved?
What do you mean, how were those approved?
Like, what are you saying?
Like, what they were barred to, since they were subjugated to secondhand citizenship,
Okay.
they were not allowed to go into these places. So this is why we need to pay
So they're
reparations so
currently
that
not allowed
they
to go
can
into
create
these
equality.
places?
But anyways,
Is
I have
this
a
the status
question.
quo?
I have a quote.
Is it the status quo?
Yeah, this is not the status quo. This is saying that African Americans have been subjugated to secondhand citizenship, preventing them from
Okay.
joining these institutions.
But that
They
completely
have
contradicts
been barred.
the other part of your case in which you talk about them being like second class citizens currently, but you're also trying to argue that like when they like couldn't go into churches or whatever that like
No,
that
no,
was
that
just associated
absolutely
with
not,
reparations.
because what I'm-
that's not happening right now.
That is definitely happening. Explain to me how so many black individuals are in dropout factories. Explain to me how the 56 schools are under desegregation orders if you say that the redistricting laws and red tape is non-existent.
Okay, yeah,
Yes,
no,
my question is, how are any of your arguments unique to the?
Okay, but you're talking
let me talk. How are any of your arguments unique to the arguments made against freeing the slaves? Right, the people who were trying to free the slaves also said that this is not cost worthy. They also said that African Americans cannot integrate into white America. So how are your con arguments unique?
Okay, but how is your entire contention 3 unique? Like, how is that unique to say that reparations would solve these different issues?
We're not saying, we're making the case that they should get reparations. We're not saying like, oh, later down the road this was going to happen. No, we're saying that
Right,
they've been,
and you're
because they've been subjugated. Well, you're in the Congo.
Then it wouldn't actually.
All right, so
materialize within the real
do
world.
you think that African Americans are at the same level as whites?
That's not what we're advocating.
Yeah.
What we're saying
Are
is
you
that we all
advocating
not-
because you're
okay,
saying that none of
okay,
this
okay,
exists?
let me- can I answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, right.
Go ahead.
So we already stated in contention 3 that there have been economic advancements.
Oh, I
in
already
Americans.
responded to that. Obviously, if it's going to be in the it's in the following century
Okay, but here's
from
the thing.
slavery. So obviously
Here's the
there's going to be
thing. Okay, here's
saturation
the
in the
thing.
marketplace
Can
of
I talk?
African Americans.
Can I answer your question?
Go.
Thanks. Okay, so when we're talking about there's been an increase in managerial positions, what we're saying is that it's actually increasing these people who are actually getting these economic.
All right, but what's the date? What's the date on
opportunities.
that? I mean, not the date it was published, but what's the date in which the study was made?
I will give it to you right after.
All right,
the
I already know
response.
it because I have the same card. It's the 19th century. That's the century after slavery. So
Okay, but it's
obviously,
still
since these people have the liberty of going into these institutions, they obviously will be super saturated. Even if there's 2 people who go into these positions, that's 100% increase.
Okay, but it doesn't matter because there's the number of people who are still going. Okay.
Okay, we're gonna take the rest of our
Yeah,
class.
which is wait, let me calculate it.
Okay.
We did 37 first.
No.
We took-
They took 40 the first time.
Yeah. Do I even have? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Hold up, can we take that?
You can take that
We
now
can,
too.
yeah. You
No.
wanna go?
I know, but why would
Yeah,
you?
see, yeah.
That's the thing. Can you remove?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Anyways.
I wanted to cough, but it didn't. Just play. I'll have to go pee. Okay. Noelle, Tiffany, are you ready?
Yes.
G, are you ready? Judge, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. And lastly, Madison, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Brief off-time roadmap real quick. We're going to start with the definitions, a couple observations, and then I'm going to tell you why you should vote for con. There are.
Okay.
Okay. And, yeah. Time. So starting off with the definition where we say ought is a duty or correctness, we have upheld this throughout the whole debate and it falls to our side for these couple of reasons. The first is that we've proved our observations time and time again. Economically, we're going to be falling into debt. Politically, the U.S. federal government is the actor in this situation, and they have to look out in the best interest of the United States as a whole, not just one group. Socially, this will increase and worsen race relations. Moving on to our first our first key voting issue, which is harmful impact. So the first thing that we talk about is they're not going to be benefited. And the second is a little logistically challenging, that there's a perfect world scenario. So the pro keeps looking at a perfect world where they point out all the problems in society and how they're going to be fixing with these reparations, but they never say how they're going to actually solve for this issue. And we can't look at this without solvency or anything because they keep showing us logistically challenging things. So also, these innocent people, these taxpayers are going to be paying for this and stuff that they had nothing to do with anything. And the second key voting issue in today's round is race relations. This is extremely important, Judge, because we have clearly won today's debate just with this argument. We're saying that Pandora's boxes will be opening up to every ethnicity that has wanted race relations, and that is why you're going to be voting con today, because if we pay these African Americans reparations, everyone else will suffer. It's not the best interest of the United States to make everybody else suffer except for one minority group. Remember that this is justice on the cheap, where you're dehumanizing these people. How can you place a dollar value on someone suffering? Moving on to their key voting issue number 3, which is welfare. Just because you put money in doesn't mean the education is getting any better. We showed you already time and time again that the U.S. has actually increased their spending on education, and look where we are today. It's still not sufficient. And also, to talk about redlining, remember that the rebuttal never brought this up. So to bring this up again in summary is against rules of public forum. Don't count the redlining argument. Again, they never explained how reparations would solve this issue. And remember that we actually reformed the housing policy. So even if you wanted to buy the redlining argument, we already won that because we're showing that the housing policy has been reformed. And remember that they dropped our contention 3, so it still stands that the economic advancements of the African Americans have increased. These reasons are a cop-out.
We'll take the rest of our prep. How much it
Wait, hold on.
would have gone 4 minutes.
4 minutes, I know.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know what to say.
And tell me when you want to start.
Start now.
Okay.
Like, if you want to attack, like, the only way to attack it right now is like to get back to social.
I was done at 30, but
Oh, no. You're good.
What do you do
Alright.
at the,
just pull up to change the welfare interface.
which part?
I probably won't.
Okay.
Thank you.
Alright. Alright, so I'm just going to start off with the definitions, observations, and go into the real key voting issues of today. Alright. Opponents, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Yeah.
Noel, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Judge, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Alright, so we can try. Alright, let's begin. Let's start off with the definition of ought that our opponents proposed in this debate. First, their original definition of ought was that it's a duty, that's defined as a duty. And then later on, in their summary, they added that ought should also account for feasibility. Let's take feasibility out of this question because we agreed that ought means a duty, not adding feasibility to this argument. Because moral obligation and the duty of the United States, that trumps all that the United States should and ought to give reparations. And feasibility, again, is not a real argument in this debate because just because it's hard to do does not mean that we should not do it. Now, going on to their observations 1 through 3, the first observation is about the cost-benefit analysis. Again, their costs don't even meet their definition of ought because their costs they're just all talking about money. But money should not have to do with our duty and obligation of whether or not we should do this. Their observation 2, that economically, socially, politically, that we have to meet this criteria. They never answered how politically the reparations would harm the United States or the African Americans. So observation 2 can just be dropped from this debate. Observation 3, that this should benefit the United States as a whole. Again, this is about the key voting issues. We'll see that reparations would benefit the United States as a whole. Now going on to the first key voting issue, which is harmful effects versus general problems. If you weigh these two arguments together, you will see that the general problems that African Americans face every day, those harms far outweigh the harmful effects that our opponents bring up. The only harmful effect they bring up is feasibility and money. Again, it is a duty and obligation of the United States to pay reparations to African Americans because of all the wrongdoings, economically, socially, and politically, to African Americans since slavery until today. the harmful effects of this being too hard to do and this using some money, the whole resolution is using money. So us using money, that can't be an argument. That's just the resolution itself. We go on to the second key issue, which is race relations. Again, you have to weigh that against inequality. The inequality that African Americans face against their white counterparts far outweighs race relation problems that may occur from reparations. For these reasons, we strongly urge a probe out.
Good debate. I like that one.
Good debate.
Good debate.
Great. That's your turn.
Can we stop the camera?
No,